Hello and welcome to the Grant Professionals Association's webinar. This webinar is titled Funders Are People Too, How to Strengthen Relationships with Grant Makers Through Authentic Stewardship. My name is Kelly Romero and I am the Membership Director for GPA and your webinar moderator for today. You will be placed in listen-only mode, which means that your line is on mute. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat box on your screen to submit your questions or hit the Raise Your Hand button at the top. At the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a brief survey. We ask that you please stay with us until that survey is on your screen so that you can fill it out and assist us with our future webinars. Today's presenter is Heather Stombaugh, GPC. Heather is the Principal Consultant of Just Right Solutions and has served the nonprofit sector for 14 years, developing expertise in all areas of nonprofit management, from administration and fundraising to program design and evaluation. She is a published author, a peer reviewer, a state and federal grant reviewer, a local and national presenter, a volunteer, mentor, student, wife, and mother. Heather, please feel free to dial *7 to unmute your line and begin your presentation. Heather? Let me make
Can
sure
you hear me?
that if you hear me, please put that in the chat box to make sure that you hear me okay.
I can hear you. Can you hear me, Kelly?
Yes, okay. Got a little worried there.
Fantastic. Sorry, everyone, for that worry. I thank you all so much for joining me and Kelly today for our presentation on stewardship. We're going to talk about 4 particular subjects related to stewardship. Best practices, thinking about how do we steward major donors, and then how does that translate directly into stewarding grant makers and the people who work in our foundations and corporate philanthropy programs. We're going to talk about authentic stewardship activities and how to personalize those. We're going to discuss a couple of case studies about stewardship activities that 3 nonprofits used and the outcomes they derived from that activity. And finally, talk about how to design a stewardship plan for grant makers that's aligned with fundraising best practices. That's what we're going to talk about today, but before we do, I'd love to hear from you. What do you want to learn today? Go ahead and take a minute to enter your response. What is the one thing you want to learn today? Like to learn some new and more creative or innovative forms of stewardship. So exactly what you're presenting. Very good. We're in the right place together. Real ways to build sincere relationships with our funders. How to actually begin a conversation with a funder. I think that's a great one. Relating to different types of funders. How stewardship plays an important role in grantsmanship, and how to build relationships with funders who do not accept unsolicited requests. How to gain access to funders who don't seem to want to talk to you. That's an unfortunate reality we have to deal with at times as grant pros. How can I find out which types of stewardship activities apply as a grants manager? And definitely want to focus on staying connected with foundations. How to do this without seeming fake or harassing people. Thank you all so very much for sharing that feedback. I'm going to jump to our first slide, but there are a few more polls throughout our conversation today, and I do appreciate and value your feedback during this. I hope it is more of a conversation as much as it can be in an online webinar. So thank you. We're going to talk about a lot of that today. We are going to talk about the differences between cultivation and stewardship in a moment, but let's start with why we're here. What is stewardship? You can see the definition from CASE here on the screen. I want to share with you another definition from the AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, of which I am also a member. AFP's definition is, stewardship is a process whereby an organization seeks to be worthy of continued philanthropic support, including the acknowledgement of gifts, donor recognition, the honoring of donor intent, and that is an extremely important part of our conversation today, prudent investment of gifts, and the effective and efficient use of funds to further the mission of the organization. so you can see from hearing that and then reading the definition of stewardship on the screen, the focus here is on long-term relationship management. It's not on ask. It's about managing relationships with people. The emphasis on over time is entirely mine on the screen you see before you. This is long-term. So we're working towards long-term relationships that build sustainable funding streams and sustainable networks of funders for our work. Within a fundraising cycle, and this may look familiar to some of you, this is the basic fundraising cycle. You could Google basic fundraising cycle right now and see 100 different iterations of this basic design. This is from a colleague of ours, Ann Charles Watts, who is an ACFRE, the advanced level CFRE. And quite simply, we are today, you'll see the green arrow there, we are talking about the stewardship element, not the cultivation element. There are some crossovers, certainly, and we do steward relationships as we walk around this circle so that we can potentially cultivate and solicit for another gift, for another grant. But we're going to specifically focus today on post-award. What are those stewardship activities and plans we should engage in so that we can ensure that we are managing our relationships with our funders well. The goal of all stewardship is pretty straightforward. It's so that we do maintain those relationships in ways that lead to deeper involvement from the individuals who work at those foundations or who are affiliated with those foundations or corporate philanthropy programs. And so that we can eventually ask for more money, frankly, in the future, or maintain continued giving at one level or another. With government sources, this directly applies. Much of what I'm talking about today is on the private side, but it applies on the public side because the government is run by people. So engaging with individuals is paramount. Now, I have a quick story to interject here about work recently with a program officer at the National Endowment for the Arts, who some of you probably have experience with them. She seemingly cannot stop giving me information, and I bless her for that. She has given me so many resources, such a great and deep insight into what their review panels are truly looking for, into exactly how to work through their particular funding mechanism and align our project appropriately. She spent an hour and a half on a phone call with me. She and I have emailed each other so very many times. Now, she's certainly not the decision maker, but she's been extremely helpful in providing really detailed feedback to my many questions. There are some government agencies who don't give you that much detail, but I know even from HRSA, there are a number of program officers who want their programs to succeed so much that they've created their own YouTube video series about it so that they can answer people's questions because they know they might not always be able to get on the phone or email you back. So while, again, much of what we're talking about today is focused on the private side, private plus corporate, there is much that can translate over to stewarding people who work in our government agencies. So I'd like us to think about that. The goal certainly here is that our increased, when we are asking for more money, we should have more touch points. We should have more interaction that is extremely donor-centered, grant maker-centered, what they would like out of the relationship. So what is stewardship? By definition, we got that, but what is it really? It's about managing relationships with people at our foundations. They may be the decision makers. Certainly, we definitely want to talk to them, hear what they think, find out what they need, find out why they're here. But we're also talking about other stakeholders. So maybe it's not the decision maker, but it's the decision maker's spouse or partner, who certainly is influential. So think about the sphere of influence around that decision maker. Who are the individuals you may have access to and you may want to steward? At a family foundation, it may be that patriarch or the person who has managed the foundation. It might be their children or their grandchildren, the heirs in the family that we need to steward relationships with. And think about what does, the patriarch of the family, what is his or her or his intent for these grants and for the foundation. But if we know the granddaughter is going to take over, what's her intent going forward, and how can we steward a relationship with her so that when it comes time to make an ask to submit our next grant proposal, we're making it at the right time and in the right way to meet her intent for the foundation going forward. We may also be stewarding relationships with program officers who may not have any, some do, but may not have any relationship to the decision. They simply help us and they help the philanthropist invest the money wisely. I think we can all probably agree, if we're working in private side, that those program officers are a phenomenal resource, and I take as many as possible to lunch when I can, whether or not I'm working on something at the time. They're full of information. Then there's also the gatekeepers, and so in some corporate foundations, the actual gatekeeper is the CEO's executive assistant. And so stewarding a relationship with that individual so that the gate doesn't slam in your face is paramount. It's almost as essential as stewarding the CEO of that foundation, is making sure that we are keeping in line, that we're using the right words, and that we're maintaining and invigorating a relationship with every people who are involved with that organization. And what I'd like to talk about today are some creative ideas about ways we can do that, and think about more touch points. What are the ways in which we can provide more cues to action for people to think, this is why I want to invest in this organization. This is why they've got me by the heart and by the mind. This is why I want to be here. And what we want to do is increase those touch points so they think about that more often. It makes them that much more likely to give in the future. All of these apply to donors as much as they do to grant makers, so there's definitely crossover in our fundraising framework. So best practices of stewardship. Stewardship tends to mean time, talent, and treasure. In faithful communities, there are other elements to it, and this is a lot of where this language has come from, is faith-based giving. But we also, if we think about stewarding the land as farmers, we are trying to make sure that that investment in the soil, in the potential crop yields, is maintained over the long term. We certainly don't want to kill the field so that it never produces crops again. We want to steward that asset, that resource we have available to us, so that it is here for the long term. That analogy applies directly with grant makers. We want to steward that resource so that we have access and potential time, talent, and treasure to be gained at the end of the day from that relationship. Really, the essential elements are donor intent. I mentioned that in the definition. The donor intent is absolutely paramount, and donor intent is different than priorities of giving. We need to be strategic in the way that we communicate. In doing so, we need to be consistent in that we're communicating through multiple channels, and we're doing it with an appropriate level of frequency, I should say. It needs to be professionally organized and managed, meaning there should be a calendar. For all of us grant writers, there should be a Gantt chart somewhere, some sort of project management tool we are using to steward our grant makers. This is beyond the grant report, to steward them and to make them feel welcome, make them feel like part of the team, and listen to what their interests are. It is an appropriate balance between the donor's right to know what's going on and their absolute right to the intent of their grant, but also to the institution's fiduciary responsibilities. So we have to balance that, and there's certainly some ethical quandaries we could read about online anytime about how many strings are attached to that grant. Folks who may, which has happened in my experience, as someone said, I'm happy to give you this grant, this $50,000 grant, I just want a seat on the board. Well, as we'll continue to talk about, there are policies that you should have in place, gift acceptance, grant acceptance, policies in place that would either okay or preclude that from happening. That's up to your organization's discussion and governance. Excuse me. But I think that it's a matter of listening to the types of donors you have, understanding what kinds of gifts and grants you are willing to accept and from whom, and honoring that intent as you go forward, keeping that all very transparent as we discuss. And ultimately, and that's why this little sign is here, we never treat grant makers like ATM machines, right? And I wonder if anyone has had that experience. I unfortunately have, working with a very small nonprofit for the first time, reaching out to a funder and finding out, we gave them a grant, yeah, but they never sent their grant report, and we never heard from them again after we sent the check. That's a worst case scenario, certainly. But in that case, sadly, that nonprofit treated that funder like an ATM machine. Too many do. So when we are creative in the way, in not only doing the bare minimum of sending a thank you letter and fulfilling our grant reporting obligations, when we do more, we look very different. Our nonprofits and our organizations look very different than others, than the majority, frankly, who don't. So think about if you're in an institution that has a development team, beyond, if you're the only person in that shop, then the same things apply. Very similar things apply for the major gift side to the grant maker side, because that's where we sit in the types of giving. If you're in a shop with multiple development professionals, so maybe you're responsible for grant awards and others are responsible for major gifts, planned giving, etc., then this should all be coordinated. And it should look similar, so that if you have a grant maker who's giving it $50,000, the types of stewardship they have may look very similar to if a major donor is giving you $50,000. Maybe not. That is a discussion and some decisions that you have to make. It would make sense to me that they would look somewhat similar because it's the same level of giving. Part about stewardship, frankly, all cultivation, all development work is based upon the Donor Bill of Rights. So here's a kind of small and a little hard for my eyes to read version of it, but I also provided you a copy of it, of the Donor Bill of Rights from the Association of Fundraising Professionals. So the whole point of this, and I'm going to go through each of the items on this checklist, is that people give for the common good. They give because they have confidence in our organizations. They believe our organizations have the capacity and credibility to do what it is we say we're going to do, that we've provided adequate evidence to convince them that there is a need and that we have the right solution, and that we're sustainable, that they're not investing in a sinking ship. That's why they give. So if we go through each of these 10 categories, the first, to be informed of the mission of the way the organization intends to use donated resources, that's a matter of confidence. Donors need to be confident. Grant makers need to be confident in your organization's ability to effectively use gifts and grants for their intended purposes. There's that intent towards again. They need to be confident in the board and the expectation that the board will exercise prudent judgment. So that's also our responsibility. So we need to meet that donor intent. And part of that is in some of the activities we'll discuss, having the board reach out to grant makers, having board members directly involved in your stewardship activities. That makes them feel much more confident when there's a leader involved in that conversation. They want to see transparency, having access to financial statements, of course. Number 4 is all about intent, to be ensured that their gifts or grants will be used for the purposes for which they are given. Now, many of our grants have grant agreements. We have notices of award. People have to sign their contracts. So some of that takes care of itself because our strings, as development pros might call them, the strings are quite clear in many cases. But I'm sure some of you have had experience with the Family Foundation check that arrives in the mail and you never asked for it, and we say thank you so very, very much. What was your intent for that grant? What would you like to do with that? Oh, it's operating. Fantastic. That does not mean we stop there, of course. We should have a full-bore strategic stewardship plan for how to manage that relationship after that wonderful, out-of-the-sky gift. Number 6 and 7 are all about confidentiality of our donors and our grant makers to the extent that's appropriate for grant makers. For donors, a little different. Some grant makers have public information releases they have to do based on the IRS. Number 8 is about transparency, to be informed about the people who are seeking grants are volunteers, employees, or hired solicitors. So I'm sure some of you have run into the grant application where it asked, do you have a consultant grant writer, an employee grant writer, or a volunteer? who is submitting this application. And there are grant makers who will never fund you if you say you hired a consultant. They just simply don't believe, that we could argue with, that they don't necessarily believe that that's a good investment or a good way to use the money. Or there are some grant makers who get very excited and they're like, you're investing money in development, knowing and recognizing that grants is an appropriate revenue stream for your organization. I like how you're diversifying your funding opportunities. So it's a good thing. But that's the reason. They want to know who is asking. And some grant makers, they go either way, really. So it's about transparency. They also want to know about mailing lists and not releasing their information, so again, confidentiality. But number 10, to feel free to ask questions when making a gift and to receive prompt, truthful, and forthright answers. It's about the power of their investment. So it's their intent plus what you intend to do with it. What's the intent plus impact? What is the return on their investment in your organization? And that may have emotional, I'm positive, I'm sure we can all agree it'll have emotional elements, but it'll also have rational elements that have to do literally with an ROI calculation or with number of people served, number of additional people served, etc. So how do we do that? Let's talk about consistent communication. Honoring the Donor Bill of Rights, which we should all have hanging up in our offices. Consistent communication. For every ask, every time we write a grant proposal, especially for people who have funded us, we should have at least 7 times where we communicate with them and don't ask them for a thing. So that easiest way to do that is, frankly, through social media, because the last number I saw was that approximately 16% of nonprofits followed their funders on social media. So in this case, I believe that study was specifically Facebook and Twitter from the Center on Philanthropy. So if I'm already, if I start following my funders, I'm already way ahead of the game. I'm way ahead of everybody else because most people aren't doing it. Less than a fifth of the nonprofits I'm competing with are actually following their funders. And frankly, talking cultivation here, that's a really easy one, right? Really easy one to go online and follow potential funders and prospects. And it's not just following. In stewardship, we certainly also want to share. When they release good news, we want to share it. When they have a great story to sell, we want to maybe type a little message about what we think about it in a positive, hopefully, way. Those are ways that it's meaningful engagement and goes beyond just my name is on your like list. We invite people out for tours. We host events. We have their name or some communication coming from the website. We send direct mails. We maybe have video or ads of some nature. There are many, many ways to communicate in person through traditional media or through digital media, and we should use them all. And we should use them all with frequency. In order to reach that, if I'm asking them for a grant once a year, okay, now I have at least 7 other times I should be talking to them in the next year. Beyond the grant report, I should be doing some other things. So those are some ideas of the types of channels we can use. We'll talk about specific activities we can use therein momentarily. We want the engagement to be authentic, and that I think is a lot of what folks said at the beginning of this webinar. What does that mean? There's a term called participatory fundraising, and it's a strategy where you pull a lot of people together to do one thing. So to do something like a walkathon or a phone-a-thon or maybe even an online campaign through social media. That's one way that you could get people involved if that's really what jazzes them. The campaign chairperson. Perhaps you have a fantastic grant maker who has done wonderful things for your organization, and you just simply want to name them an honorary campaign chairperson. Their name alone will bring in some additional gifts, and it's also a means of recognizing their great philanthropic support. You could invite them to join an advisory board. These are just 3 simple examples of authentic engagement, and it's all based upon the particular grant maker, the contact their interests, and what you think would be the most exciting to them. Some people at a, more progressive, perhaps organization, maybe it's all online, participatory fundraising is probably going to be something that gets them more excited than serving as a campaign chairperson. Campaign chairperson may be reserved for someone who has been around for a long time and someone who everybody knows, and it's a way to honor them. Advisory board might be for someone who wants, to put something else on their resume, and that would be exciting for them, and that would be meaningful to them. Authenticity is reached when the individual reaches a balance between their emotional, mental, and physical investments in our organization. So that are they emotionally connected to it? Do they know the stories? Do they have the stories to understand? Have we shared those with them in ways that are meaningful? Are they mentally in the game, intellectually? Do they get the numbers? Do they feel the numbers are compelling? Have they physically been on site ever? Which is sometimes something we forget about. We have these great places where so many of us who've worked in nonprofits for a long time, you can walk in one nonprofit, nobody say a word to me, don't talk to me, and I can tell you a lot about your organization just from walking in the door, by feeling it, by hearing it, by smelling it, by seeing what's in your lobby or not, by seeing the people milling about or people running. Those tell us very, very different things. Are people in jeans or are people in suits? Do people have closed doors or do they have open doors? Is there music playing or not? Do you have carpet on the ground, or is it, you've got furniture and you're cobbling together what you can because you've got a lot to do? We can learn a lot about organizations in that way by simply being there. And that's a way that you can get your grant makers, if you can get them on site, they have a physical presence, and now they're becoming more physically invested in your organization. Same thing if you invite them to events, to your walks, and to other activities where you are there. Your organization's culture is present. That's really what that little logo there from Leadership Guides is referring to. Finally, we need to listen. And this is a key for cultivation as well as stewardship. I'm going to talk about cultivation very briefly. On the cultivation side, prior to making an ask, my advice to nonprofits is always, you go in, you have your 5-minute spiel, take them to lunch, have a 5-minute spiel, and then stop talking. Eat your lunch and let them talk. And that's exactly what happened with this program officer from the National Endowments for the Arts. I just let her talk. I asked her a couple questions, and she just spilled. It was so much great information that I can never find anywhere else. I'm sure many of you have had similar experience. On the stewardship side, and people engage for multiple reasons, we should learn why they are here. We should ask, why are you here? Why do you want to give? What could our organization be doing better? Do they have suggestions for us? Now, we don't have to take all of that, but certainly ask, and they might have a great idea. Show them you care about what they think and respect their suggestions and concerns. Maybe do surveys, maybe do focus groups. Certainly do one-on-ones, especially with the bigger grant makers in your docket. And you're going to learn quickly who needs to be engaged through entertainment, novelty, and enjoyment. They love going out to that beautiful restaurant. They love sitting there for 2 hours. They want to have a conversation about the zoo and the museum and the symphony and more than just your nonprofit. Listen, you owe them that. We owe them that. Help them understand, educate them. If there are some individuals who just want to know deep, deep, deep details on why do those kids need that particular intervention? Why do premature babies and their families, when they get released from NICUs, have to have XYZ interventions for the next 3 years? Why? Tell me. And tell me what those interventions are like. There are some folks who are very jazzed up about that. So find out who they are and be able to listen to them and gather that knowledge and use that to your advantage as you plan activities. People who may feel guilty and that's why they're giving, help them understand why they don't need to. Empower their gift, empower their investment in your organization. Help them understand exactly when you give $50,000, it equals X. It changes the world in this way. And it should be one sentence. It changes the world in this way. That one sentence might be specific statistics. I would imagine it probably has an element of emotion in it. And I might even use a single story, of a single family. Now we use that on the cultivation side too, but that particular tactic should not change. That we should continue to do on the stewardship side, and it's one of the activities we will discuss. So we need to think about why the people are here, and then we need to ask them and give them the time to share their intention and their interest in our organization. It makes them feel like they're an insider, which is ultimately what we're looking for in managing and maintaining these relationships over the long term. So we have another poll. There are actually 2 polls right in a row here. We're going to go through the polls, and as soon as we're done with that, there are a couple of questions in the box, it looks like, and so I'll answer those. But let's do our polls first. The next time you sit down with a grant maker, with somebody who is currently funding your organization, what will you ask them? Go ahead and take a minute to respond. I love it. What inspired you to fund our organization? What's on your mind? I like that one. It's nice and general. What are your top concerns for your foundation? Are you pleased with what you have heard from us? What are your thoughts about our organization? Ooh, this is a nice specific one. What is it about higher education that makes you continue to give? How do you think we could better serve the community if we had additional resources? I like that pointed question. That's a good one. One that came to mind for me is, why are you a part of this foundation? What motivated you to serve on this board? What happened in your last strategic planning process? Turn it all on them and turn it all on their service in that foundation. And I call that outward-facing talk versus inward-facing talk. And we do that a lot in nonprofits. You know, we become very siloed, and we're entrenched in our own culture and our own way of thinking, and the day-to-day, oh my goodness, the toilet doesn't work, and we need to fill a pantry for these people, and those folks' car broke down in the parking lot, and the copy machine doesn't work. That's life. And we get stuck in that. So, but when we're outward-facing and we look at we talk to this person and ask them, why are you on this board? Why are you interested in supporting, prematurity, if that was the type of work your organization does? Here's another question. Will your priorities be changing or moving in another direction soon? That's a very good one because, as we all know, foundations have been changing their priorities considerably over the last few years. What are your thoughts about our program? And what service have you not funded that you are interested in funding? I think that's interesting. Is there a gap that you see, philanthropic investor, that you think that someone in this community should be filling and nobody's asking you to fund it? I like that. So thank you again, everyone who responded to that. Very good feedback. And those are all great. I think we could come up with some more. And those are the types of things we should think about as we talk about later in our conversation today, planning, writing out these questions, and just thinking in our head, what kinds of things do I want to know to really get at the root of why this person is here and what their intent for the grants are, and how can I maintain that relationship by honoring those things. So here's a quick and dirty question. How are cultivation and stewardship different? Go ahead and take a minute to respond there in your own words. Quick response, cultivation is pre-award and stewardship is post-award. Pre and post-award, pre and post-award. Very good. Okay. I'm seeing that so far. And there, I actually read an article recently that said that there is no difference. I would argue, and I'll go back to the farming analogy because that's where I'm from, when we steward land, and that's like 100 years. When my grandfather's land was stewarded before he was born, that, and it continued to be stewarded as he was a teenager and before he took over farming. Cultivation is what we do that year when we're about to plant a crop, right? We cultivate the soil, we get it ready for growing. So that's I think the really clear, the difference in my head, long-term versus short-term. Cultivation is the purpose of getting money. Stewardship is saying thank you. I would also say you have to keep cultivating current donors, absolutely. And it always comes back to that cycle because that is And that's what we do. We're raising money, right? We're raising money, so we need to come back to an ask at some point in time, and that is exactly where the cultivation is. Cultivation, getting a funder interested. Stewardship, rewarding them. I like that. Cultivation shapes your ask. Stewardship sets you up. I'm sorry, the screen is for the next one exactly. I see cultivation as a process with distinct end when the award is secured, and then stewardship begins. Cultivation prepares us for asks. Stewardship is continuing relationships. Excellent. You guys have all given great responses, and this is a checkpoint to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'm positive we are. So thank you so much for your feedback and understanding the technical differences between the two terms. So let's go ahead and jump right into authentic activities. Actually, I apologize. I said I was going to do something, and I didn't. I have at least 2 questions here. And Kelly, please do tell me if I'm missing one. From Cindy. Hi, Cindy, up in Sylvania, Ohio. What level of stewardship are grant funders looking for? Great question. The answer is it depends. It depends on who they are. And there are some grant makers who expect high levels of stewardship. They expect to be treated like a major donor. They expect to be treated like a donor and not more on the donor side than on what may be considered a traditional grant maker side, where you do your biannual reports and do exactly what it said in your grant agreement. They expect more than that. They expect more traditional donor stewardship activities. There are other grant makers who don't want any of that, who don't have a Facebook page, who state in their notice of award in your grant agreement, never send out a press release about us. Don't talk about us with other people. We want to maintain our anonymity, a confidentiality of our giving, despite the fact they have, IRS documents. But they ask for that. That's their intention in giving the gift. We'll respect that. So I'm sorry, Cindy. Terrible answer, but it's the truth. It does depend on your relationship, your current relationship with that funder, your knowledge of the sphere of folks you have to work with there. What kind of people are they? Are they going to be the ones who expect to go to the really swanky restaurants? Or, as happened relatively recently, a grant maker said, you know what, I don't meet at those restaurants, but I'd love to meet you at Taco Bell, which I found really fascinating. But he felt very strongly about not spending money on what he felt was silliness. He's just like, just take me to Taco Bell and get me a taco, I'll be fine. So it depends. Next question. In terms of social media touch points, should these activities vary depending on the amount of the grant award? Carrie, that is an exceptionally good question. Should the level of visibility be tied into the value of the grant award? Yes. I think that there is a lot of room for us as grant pros to use naming and recognition levels, similar to what you would for a capital campaign or for a major event. So think sponsorship levels. If someone gave you $50,000 as a platinum sponsor, they get a heck of a lot more than someone who comes in at that silver, bronze, or even lower levels as sponsors. So some of that translates directly here. Social media is so easy. I might, make sure I follow and like. I might share. But there are other, for the higher level gifts, I might do a very specific campaign, a set of engagement opportunities on social media just for that grant or at a particular time of year. So yes, there is. I would encourage there to be variety, and some of it has to do with, thank you, Terry, for the transition, personalization of the activity and personalizing so that it's tied to donor intent and also tied to something common sense that we create internally in our plan to show the differences between types of grant makers. So let's talk activities. At the minimum, what we should be doing is on your screen now. The receipt of award is a grant agreement. We sign it and we get it back immediately, not 2 weeks later, immediately. They're giving us money. They deserve a piece of paper and a signature. Acknowledgement is different than receipt. So we acknowledge their gift through, I would argue, a form letter, the letter you send out whenever anybody gives you a grant award, and a handwritten note from the CEO for every grant. Maybe there's a minimum number you want to use for that. Whatever your organization's minimum threshold. Maybe it's $1,000. Maybe it's $5,000. Maybe it's $50,000. Whatever is appropriate for your grant revenue average. But definitely send out the form letter for sure. And always, always, always a CEO handwritten note. They are so uncommon. I guess many of you would agree. I rarely get handwritten notes. When you do, people recognize it, and more often than not, I get thank you notes for my thank you notes, so, which is a lovely thing. Definitely do a thank you call, certainly within the first 48 hours. These, if any of you work in a development office, these should look really familiar because they are exactly what you should do with a gift, a donation as well. We should do a thank you call. We should do a press release. Press releases have, in my experience, yielded donations. They yield other gifts because, especially if it gets picked up by the news, certainly, and it's an exciting thing, something new, a new relationship. We're promoting the grant maker. I have seen that turn into, oh, they gave you money, so I'm going to write you a check for $100, or I'm going to write you a check for $5,000. I one time got a $10,000 anonymous gift because 2 local foundations had invested in a small vocational training program. So it's an opportunity, and it's not going to happen every time, and they don't always pick up your press releases, unfortunately. But it is a process worth doing, and there are certainly messages in those press releases you could transition over to social media. If you have a newsletter, use it. Highlight your grant makers in your newsletters, and make sure you recognize when new ones come in with awards and what that award was for, and then what it supports. And certainly do grant reports. Submitting them before the deadline is noticed by program officers. I imagine some of you have heard that before. Now, this is a little fuzzy on the screen. I apologize. This comes back to Terry's question about personalization, really. It depends on what you quantify as your levels, right? So $1,000 to $10,000 to $50,000 to $100,000, whatever you decide are your levels, rank out the activities that are appropriate. So if it's everybody should be getting receipts, thank yous, and those phone calls. Everybody should be stewarded. They should get a report of the activity, and they should get some letter or communication from the CEO or president of your organization. The more money they give, the more likely it is that you're going to do these in-person activities. So special events, annual thank you letters, other kinds of thank yous from other board members or from the people you serve, one-on-one engagement, some kind of recognition in a special society of grant makers, sustainers or something, and then other types of advisory groups or some of the other types of activities and engagement that I mentioned previous. So it does matter, it should matter, on levels of giving as tied to how you personalize those activities. Again, I'm sorry for the blurriness of that slide. Penelope Burke, I hope you have heard of her. If you've not, I would highly encourage you to check out her resources. She's the author of Donor-Centered Fundraising, which is one of the manuals you should definitely read if you're ever going to sit for the CFRE. And personalization is donor-centered. It makes stewardship very much donor-centered on their intent. People get prompt and meaningful acknowledgement. Gift goes for something specific, and they get a report with measures. We should all know how to do that pretty well on what was accomplished, and that is beyond your $5,000 bought new piece of equipment. Your $5,000 through that piece of equipment served XYZ, which changed people's lives in these very real ways. And give a story. That's always lovely. According to Penelope, 84% of donors said that they would give again to your organization if they received a personalized thank you that clearly identified how the gift benefited your organization. So it's not just that thank you first off. Let's do thank yous after. So outside of the grant report, send a thank you note from the CEO. If you have little kids in your organization, if you've ever been in one of my training programs before, little kids, little handprints or little signatures on a piece of paper or a handmade card, that touches anybody almost anywhere. Those are nice, meaningful, and authentic things. If you have kids, if you serve kids, obviously. If you serve dogs or cats, maybe you have paw prints that go in a thank you card. Thanks from Mikey. thanks from Mazzy, my thought. Thanks from, we appreciate your grant. It changed, changed where we get to sleep at night. It changed so on and so forth. So think about ways in which you can tie it to something that is meaningful to that particular donor. And there are some really interesting results that go with this. This is from, excuse me, a study that was done on this idea of the likelihood of giving a grant again, or giving a gift again, but it applies directly to grants on the private side especially. If we are personalizing and making our activities very much donor-centered, 67% more likely to give in this particular study as opposed to Penelope's. Likelihood of making a larger gift, 52% would be more likely to make a larger gift because you have stewarded that relationship in a way that it honors their intention and their interests in your organization. Likelihood of continuing to give indefinitely. Now, I'm not sure that that necessarily applies to all foundations or corporate philanthropy programs. I think that's a bit unrealistic. But I'm sure many of us have experience with foundations who do give for 5 and 10 years at a time, some longer than that. Think about other creative types of activities, and there are many. There's some on the screen here, and I'm going to read to you some other ones. The one I should say here, donor to donor, have one major grant maker speak to another one about why they give. If you've got that kind of relationship, use that asset to your advantage. Maybe get them all at the table at the same time. Talk about vision, talk about thanks, and talk about where your organization is going in the future, and that they are a major part of making that happen. They are a major part of your success, and you are so grateful for their involvement. They work. I've worked with a number of organizations that do these grant maker breakfasts or lunch, and they can be so terribly successful. People are often worried, like, that doesn't sound like, I don't think people will show up. Yes, they will. They will show up. Ask for 10, 5 will show up. Feed them, of course, but give them some coffee, some mash, and be brief. But don't make an ask, and just talk about you, grant makers, are the reason why these wonderful successes have happened in the last 3 years. Let's look at what those successes are. Here is where we are headed in the future based upon our strategic plan that went through the board governance process, and talking about credibility and confidence in your organization's leadership. We have enjoyed working with your foundations. We'll continue to keep you abreast of changes. We'd love to hear your feedback. Now open the floor. Some other ideas. Organize 2 face-to-face meetings with donors, with your grant maker, where the only reason you're talking to them is to thank them. You're not asking them for anything. You're simply thanking them for being a part of your work. At a special event, you have special events, so at your special event, have a special time in the program where you're thanking your grant makers as major givers to your organization. Acknowledge people's milestones, their birthdays, their anniversaries, the birth of a new child, etc., with cards. If someone in the family passes, send flowers if it's appropriate for their faith and their family's culture. Be authentic and meaningful in doing so. If that's not something your organization would ever even consider doing, don't do it. But I'm sure we've all worked for many organizations that is totally normal. That is something we would do with staff. That's something we would do with volunteers. And by golly, we're going to do that with our donors and grant makers too, because we're all part of the same family. Think about sending reports by electronic means as opposed to paper, especially for people who are never in their home, never in their office. They're road warriors. They're always working. Think about arranging meetings for your grant makers with program staff. Feed the program staff. Save them for their time. Prep them for it. But they are the ones who know on the ground level what's going on, and you can get their help and their feedback. I have a number of other ideas that we can talk about offline, taking out ads in National Philanthropy Day in the newspaper so that you can highlight your grant makers. There are lots of opportunities to be creative. Think about new ways, doing editorials in collaboration with grant makers. Showcasing grant makers to one another, peer-to-peer, is always a good idea. Make it meaningful, make it special, and when you can, make it unexpected. On the anniversary of their organization, they're having a 30th year anniversary, send a gift in their honor. Make them feel like part of the organization, that their effort is more than money. That's really what it comes down to. Yes or no answer real quick for this poll. Does your organization implement similar stewardship activities for donors and grant makers? We're about half and half right now. It's staying neck and neck, half and half. All right, half and half still. So I think we know we have a little bit of work to do in this area. It's lovely to see that folks are there, and we know we can challenge ourselves and improve where it isn't. But we should be using similar activities on both sides. What is one new stewardship activity you'll add this year for grant makers? Thank you, pictures from the youth we serve. I like that. Thank you, calls. Very good. You know, the one that I intend to add and ask people to do much more frequently is the peer-to-peer among grant makers talking to each other, or members of my board working with the grant makers directly. More invites to our office, methodically sharing insider information, excellent. Handwritten notes, press releases, and personal thank yous. Holiday cards. Another, and maybe New Year's to avoid any religious conflicts. I read, it wasn't Penelope Burke, and forgive me for forgetting the source. Someone suggested Thanksgiving cards because it's not necessarily, in some communities that would be really passe, but for many it would be all right to do a Thanksgiving card as a non-religious. Okay, involving program officers and meetings. Here's a couple questions. Who should make the call? Well, you could involve your entire staff. That phone call, the immediate phone call right after give, can come from anyone. And I think that you could segment it, right? So the much, much bigger gifts, your grants, you're going to have the CEO call. For smaller ones, maybe it's a program director, maybe it's a volunteer, maybe it's a member of your development team. Maybe it's me, the grant writer. How do you initiate peer-to-peer donor communication? That's an excellent question, Lindsay, and I think there's a whole other webinar to do that. But peer-to-peer donor communication, I would start with my board, because your board should be, fingers crossed, many prayers, should be major donors. If they're not, we're all working towards that, right? So if I have my major donor on my board, I can bring that person into the conversation. Who do you know? Now, if we're in a city, frankly, a lot of these people live in the same circles. Well, I know this person over there. Bring them to the table, maybe grab another grant maker who's affiliated in some way, and that's how these circles work, and have them all come to lunch at your site, and have that board member prepped for the conversation, but their goal is to talk vision. This is like 30,000-foot view stuff. These people at that peer-to-peer level should be talking big picture, and it's to build confidence in your organization. That breakfast idea I mentioned is also really helpful for that. Thanks again, everybody, for all of your comments. I'm going to breeze through our case studies right quick. We're running out of time because I talk too much. Sorry. The case studies, I have 3 for you today. 2 are good, 1's not so much. The first is a study of a homeless shelter who has been around for a very, very long time. They received their first grant from a particular foundation about a decade ago. They stewarded that relationship so well, meeting regularly with multiple generations of the family. They gave the patriarch of the family a public philanthropy award and did an entire special event just in his honor. The development team and a grant professional worked hand in hand to the extent that mid-last year, the organization learned that it didn't have to submit proposals anymore. That when they needed funding from this particular family, which has 5 pots of funding from which to draw, they didn't have to write. They just had to call. So I'd say that's a pretty darn good, and their level of giving is in 5 and 6 figures, a pretty good outcome. Second organization case study. Organization serving people with developmental disabilities has for more than a decade received annual gifts for capital projects from the patriarch of a family foundation. In the past, they always submitted one letter, a 1-page letter, simple. You can get 5 figures at least. When the granddaughter took over the foundation, she changed the entire application process. But the priorities didn't change. It was simply the process. They adjusted, but they continued stewarding both generations now, so the patriarch and the granddaughter and her husband. the last, and they have increased, so went from $80,000 in the last 3 years to $180,000 gift in 2014. This last application, which was just done, was outside of the foundation's priority areas. They only given capital. They've never, ever funded programs before and never even accepted a proposal for it. But they were so confident in the organization's rationale and the use of the funds that they awarded a $200,000 grant. Part of that is because the CEO of the organization flew to Florida to sit on the matriarch's lanai and have a nice glass of wine, and a good conversation to say why it was truly necessary and what was really going on that made a program request much more appropriate than a capital request. Finally, an organization worked 3 years ago with a grant pro to increase grants, which they did. Excellent work. But that organization afterwards never did any reports. They didn't put anyone on a mailing list. They didn't invite people to events. They didn't treat them like donors. They treated them like ATM machines. So now that this organization is in the final phase of capital campaign, they're trying to regroup. The damage is already done. And so their choices for potential new gifts or pledges to the capital campaign from organizations like corporate philanthropy programs or private family foundations is very limited. So remember, it's easier to maintain than to repair relationships. Finally, and we only have a couple of minutes, so again, I did provide you with a handout for this. What we need to do is create an actual plan. And we're all good at this. We're detail people, right? So we put things in Excel, we put them in Word documents, and we lay it out. Our stewardship plan should be a real, living, breathing document. We should think about what do we currently do, what are our acceptance and recognition policies, what does our grant agreement say, what do many of our grant agreements say, how quickly are we acknowledging people, and how much money do we have to invest in stewardship. The essential elements of that plan, which you can pull up your handout now if you'd like. I provided something from Donor by Design, Sample Donor Stewardship and Communications Matrix, and it lays out month by month, and it's segmented by level of gift. So in here it's segmented by really small numbers, $1 to $99. We're not going to do that. We're going to have, in most organizations, let's say $1,000 to $5,000. $6,000 to $9,999, $10,000 to $24,999. We're going to segment our types of grant makers a little differently. But in this handout, it goes through in January, the lower levels, they get newsletter number 1, and the higher level givers get the newsletter plus an annual meeting invitation. In February, we're going to send people a donor newsletter, all of them. Everybody gets the donor newsletter. March, they don't have anything. I would argue you should put something in March. Whether that's social media, traditional media, or some of those other ideas that we've just discussed for activities. Again, newsletters in April. In May, though, they really change it up. So we're going to do some personal phone calls for the lower level grant makers. And we're going to do some personal site visits. We're going to invite people out for tours. We're going to invite people to a special event at the higher levels of giving. That's only for them. And in that case, my guess is that the organization Donor by Design was working for actually named those donors as special. They gave them a special name. That's an idea. Especially it would work so well for private family foundations because they move and work and think very similarly to major donors. So if I was to put together this like sustaining grant maker package, call them whatever you would like, that may be really exciting to some people. They like to see their names in lights. As we move into July, again, we're segmenting out our type of newsletter, so it's a little bit different depending on who gets it, and so on and so forth. Again, these that are listed on the handout you have here are quite a bit more traditional. Some of the other ideas you could have, maybe in your newsletter you have a donor or grant maker profile, so that each month, each time you do a newsletter, you profile the fantasticness of one grant maker and then another, or the particular individual at that grant-making institution. Thank your donors out on social media. Add a field to collect Twitter handles on your donation forms and on your grant maker Find out what their Twitter handle is so that you can always be following. Look for a hashtag. Talk to Diane and Joe about this on the social media committee. Be thoughtful about your personal notes and remembering those ticklers because they're people. They have kids. Are their kids in school? Oh, gosh, their kid just graduated from college. I should send a note. Think about those sorts of things and add them to this list. Again, segmenting them out, making those meaningful and specific, personalized to the particular grantor. Create a calendar. Again, we're good at creating tools like that. So think about putting it together into a Gantt chart, some kind of project management software, or simply in an Excel spreadsheet. Use your donor database. If you are not currently tracking grants in your donor database, you should start now. They're so helpful for capturing ticklers and for tracking that very personalized bit of information. It's also, as I'm sure many of you know, helpful for tracking relationships. So if I know that at XYZ Family Foundation, Bob Jones serves as their president, Bob Jones is a donor, Bob Jones' daughter is a volunteer, Bob Jones' wife serves on another board at another foundation, and we've never asked them for money. Well, now I have an opportunity to cultivate, and I learned that through my stewardship plan. Use a team approach. If you have a team at your disposal, definitely work together. It yields so much better results. The two examples I gave you of case studies both had development professionals who worked with grant professionals. The third did not. So it is an investment in development. It yields more revenue and time. It's the same in all business, right? We got to spend money to make money. Document tasks, measure and evaluate, which is so exciting for the geek and me to say we're going to measure and evaluate the effectiveness of this approach, of this matrix. Did that stewardship process for XYZ Foundation actually yield a bigger gift in the future? Did it yield someone who's more engaged, perhaps potential board member, et cetera, et cetera? Oh, his wife is over at this other foundation, and now we can get in the door there, and we never could before. Integrate your stewardship and cultivation activities so that you are priming for that ask, as so many of you appropriately put in your response. You're priming people for that future ask through that relationship building. Think about segmenting people out by size or by geography, and be realistic about your time and your budget. We don't have a million years to do this. We have a lot of proposals to be writing as well. So think about that. Keep and grow your relationship. This is from Kay Sprinkle-Grace and Alan Windruff. Kay Sprinkle-Grace is a phenomenal philanthropy guru. So I thought this is a fascinating way to think about how we evaluate our investments over time. The relationship grows, investments are renewed, and it is a continuous process of organization engagement. Where's my highlighter here? Organizational engagement, and how the donor's physical, mental, and emotional investment in our organization through information sharing and their understanding, our ability to help them understand investment as it's tied to the actual impact. Impact meaning, how do people's lives change? Not your outputs, not an outcome statement, but truly in a short message, how do people's lives change because of their grant? So we are on our final slide here. What is your next, and there's at least one more question in the chat room I will answer, but for everyone, what's your next step for more effective grantmaker stewardship? What are you going to do today? Or tomorrow? It's already the end of the day. Develop a plan. I agree with whoever put that. Is actually putting it on paper, I think, is kind of the more exciting. Create the 12-month plan, revisit and revitalize, add in ideas for new and creative ways, share lessons learned at the next fund development team meeting. I think that's a great idea. We all speak the same language. We're often in the same rooms. But as a grant writer first and then a fundraising professional, I know that sometimes we're like, oh, just go talk to them. They know the technical stuff. Go talk to them. We all speak the same language, and the best practices apply across that field. Create an internal timeline. Very good. Do an inventory of grants and develop a calendar, and increase communication with funders and potential funders. Exactly. Cultivate and stewardship. They should walk hand in hand. They're on the same circle, right? Very good. Thank you all so much for your feedback there. One final question here, and I'm sorry we are 4 minutes over. What about if I want one of my longtime foundation donors to promote my organization to other foundations? Lindsay, that's a great question. You know, in many communities, there are grant-making groups who meet formally and publicly, and there are also those groups who don't, who you know that they do, but nobody knows where they're meeting or when they meet. So knowing about that is essential. Are people having those kinds of meetings? Like at the Donors Forum would be a good example in Chicagoland. What I might do with one of my longtime foundation donors, one of my mainstays, like the example of that long-term relationship with the patriarch, I may say, talk to that individual and ask for their help, and talk to them about, I would like your help talking to this specific foundation because I know you have a relationship, or because your foundations have an affinity, or et cetera, et cetera. And talk to them about what you would like them to do, what your expectations are, what you would hope the potential result is, and see if they're interested and gain their buy-in to that process. It may take a couple of conversations before they're comfortable doing that, but by and large, the people especially who are running these foundations and are at that higher level, that is a process they've become comfortable with. It's something they do at special events. I know many foundation board members who they go to the same events. They, at least in smaller communities like Toledo, their kids are marrying into each other's families. They're at the same family events, let alone community events. And so they are talking about us. They're talking about our nonprofits. They know intimate details. They know who is funding who when. So I think that Toledo is one example, having done work in New York City or Chicago or LA, that holds true there, I've noticed as well. So maybe not to the same limited extent as it does in Northwest Ohio, but it does hold true in much larger urban areas too. So think about sitting down and talking to them about what your thoughts are, your expectations, and how they could help. And offer it as this is a way you could, physically, the physical get in the game. All right. Well, we are over, but I'm fine with answering any questions. I'm so glad so many of you have stayed with us. Please, if you have other questions, go ahead and pop them in the box now. Or I don't know about unmuting the line. Kelly, you tell me.
It's completely up to you. I know there's going to be a lot of background noise if we unmute the line, but
okay.
If anybody does have a question, you can hit the raise your hand button at the top of your screen, and we'll get your line unmuted for you.
Thank you.
And Heather, I'm going to move to your last slide so you can do you want them to email you if you have questions, or if they have questions, or email me?
Either way, I'll just put my email address right in the box to everyone.
Perfect.
And feel free, if I don't get to your question today, do feel free to email me. I can't stop talking, so that's to answer questions.
It looks like Terry would like to know, how can an organization navigate the desire to do more personal touches from the CEO or ED when he or she is so busy?
That's a great question. I mean, the one statistic I've read is that when a CEO is actually involved in a grant ask, so on the cultivation side, it has a 30% greater likelihood of being funded. So, I mean, I would just want them to understand that about how important. I think there's an educational piece in there as well. I understand the busyness factor, but how about on, one Wednesday a month, the CEO sits and writes out a couple handwritten notes. Their level of investment doesn't have to be as extreme. It's really defining the notes, making a follow-up call, and really, if you segment it to those bigger grant makers, their time is not going to be as cumbersome in that process. They are going to have to be involved in events, but this is also why we have boards, right? And so we've got to, and I know what I'm saying when I say that, but we do need to spread the love around. Part of a board member's job beyond governance and financial or fiscal responsibility is fundraising and going out and serving as ambassadors to improve long-term sustainability. So CEO, have them do what they can. Board members do other our job as grant pros, and then the rest of the development team can handle some of those smaller tactics like social media and things like that. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And it looks like there's one more. Lindsay says this may be off topic, but do you have a favorite method for tracking donor stewardship activities?
This sounds silly, but Excel. I mean, I still haven't found a database that does what I need it to do all the time, so Excel. But when there is a donor database that exists in your organization, use that, because most of them have some kind of stewardship tracking functionality. So if you're not currently using the database, the donor database in your organization, find out how you can.
Perfect. Okay, so we want to be mindful of everybody's time. Heather, do you have anything in closing?
No, but I just want to thank everyone so much for staying over. I apologize for that, and thank you for your great questions and your fantastic feedback.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay, well, that concludes our webinar. You should be seeing a short survey on your screen right now. So if you can take a few moments and take that for us, we would really appreciate it. Provide us with any future topics for our webinars, as well as evaluate the webinar today and the presenter. Again, Heather, thank you so much for all the time you've taken to share your information and expertise about strengthening relationships through stewardship. And thank you to all who have attended. We're so glad that you can join us, and we hope that this session was helpful for you. Don't forget that later today you are going to be receiving the recorded version of this webinar, so please feel free to view that as many times as you like, and view our calendar on the website for any future webinars in 2015. We appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.